welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alastair Stephens. This week we conclude our introduction to the Ultimate Spider-Man, brackets Peter Parker, brackets Brian Michael Bendis, brackets the year 2000, with Volume 2, Learning Curve, covering issues 8 to 13, originally released between June and November of 2001. Now, last week we talked a lot about the origin of Spider-Man, both in our world and in Peter Parker's personal splinter of comic book continuity, and this week we're going to look primarily at how Bendis builds out the reality of what was, in that first volume, a very small world. Peter and May and Ben form a tight nuclear family. We expand that to include Peter's circle of friends, or at least acquaintances at school, and one primary villain. But part of the genius underlying Spider-Man as a character was Stan Lee's understanding of the tensions between the two sides of who Spider-Man is. He's a nerd and he's an athlete. He's a teenager, but he functions in the world like an adult. He's an insider and an outsider. He belongs and he does not belong. He is normal and he is amazing. And those complications begin to generate stories when they meet the expectations and the boundaries of society, the expectations and the boundaries of others, including, interestingly, the expectations and indeed the boundaries of the reader. Before we get to all of that, a quick timeline of the Ultimate Universe, because the success of that first volume of Ultimate Spider-Man leads to the expansion of the line immediately, and because Marvel Comics are interconnected basically from the beginning, the addition of these new comics in the line speaks to the expansion of Spider-Man's society, the increasing scale of this Ultimate Universe. Let's take a look here at the first slide, where you will see the covers of Ultimate X-Men 1, The Ultimates Volume 1, and Ultimate Fantastic Four number 1. So the Spider-Man title begins in September of 2000 and is followed in February of 2001 by Ultimate X-Men number 1, written by Mark Millar, one of the architects of the Ultimate Universe. It was drawn here by Andy Kubert. Millar would write 33 issues before being replaced by some guy called Brian Michael Bendis in August of 2003, who would be followed by Brian K. Vaughan for 3 years, who was followed by Robert Kirkman for 2 more. That's a list of some of the most significant comics creators of the 2000s. Vaughan wrote Runaways and Y the Last Man and Saga, while Kirkman created The Walking Dead. Millar would also write the Ultimate Universe, reimagining the Avengers, this team called the Ultimates, which is the single greatest influence over the development of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the MCU take on all of these familiar characters. The Ultimates begins in 2002 and runs for 13 issues, written by Millar and drawn by Brian Hitch. Millar, particularly at this point, is, the opposite of Bendis. His comic style is the opposite of Bendis's decompressed, dialogue-heavy David Mamet style. With Hitch, Millar defines an approach to comics which he describes as widescreen, which means operatic emotions and titanic full-page spreads and compressed action. The Ultimates continues for another 15 issues from 2005 to 2007, and as I say, has a lot in common with the MCU depictions of Iron Man and S.H.I.E.L.D., and particularly, of course, Nick Fury, who is drawn in the comics as resembling the famous actor Samuel L. Jackson. There's a odd little time loop happening there. In 2004, Millar and Bendis co-write the brand new Ultimate Fantastic Four title, which is perhaps not the best demonstration of either of their particular talents. They only write 6 issues together, but the series continues on for 60 in total. In 2009, advancing quite a ways down the timeline of the Marvel Ultimate Universe, the storyline Ultimatum, written by Jeff Loeb, brings this phase of the Ultimate Universe to something of an end. Despite Bendis's soap opera inclination, despite his relatively grounded take on character and characterization, it's Millar's influence that gives the Ultimate Universe a reputation as a place where gritty and shocking and violent and provocative stories happen in a kind of ever-expanding continuity vacuum that, obviously, is unsustainable. So Ultimates 3, which is also written by Loeb, begins a story in which the Scarlet Witch is killed, followed by her brother's death at the hands of Hawkeye of the Avengers. Magneto, the father of both Wanda and Pietro in this continuity, vows revenge and begins an apocalyptic war, which then plays out in the pages of the comic. It's not good, and the reception was maybe even worse than it deserved. This doesn't technically mark the end of the Ultimates line, though it effectively does. Through the second issue of Ultimate Spider-Man Requiem, second issue of Ultimate Spider-Man Requiem reveals that Peter Parker does not die in the defense of New York City, as we've been led to believe, we've kind of already played out his death and the emotional consequences to his supporting cast, including J. Jonah Jameson, about whom we'll have more to say in just a little while. Just a footnote here for the sake of consistency. The Ultimate Universe is eventually destroyed completely in Secret Wars 1 in 2015, in which Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four builds a lifeboat to carry characters to the quote-unquote real Marvel Comics universe, the 616, including Miles Morales, the new Ultimate Universe Spider-Man. The Ultimate Universe then ends properly, fully, completely in 2015. And just last year, a new Ultimate imprint began, masterminded by Jonathan Hickman and set on an Earth very different from our own. I haven't read a single panel of it, so I can't speak to its quality. If you have read it and think I should pick it up, then please do let me know. Besides these big titles, though, there are more than a dozen limited series happening in the same continuity, usually running 5 or 6 issues, building out the rest of the world. And that's really the problem, because for all that the Ultimate line was conceived as a new beginning for Spider-Man and the Marvel Universe as a whole, it's also conceived with a modern level of interconnectivity, and those connections propagate with enormous rapidity. By the time Ultimatum hits, it feels as though the Ultimate Universe isn't a clean continuity-free space for new readers. It's just a whole other alternate continuity to the main 616, which has now become more popular than it was back in 1999 and 2000 when the Ultimate Universe was conceived as a narrative necessity to draw in new readers. There's work to be done, I think interesting academic, analytical work to be done about the ways in which fictional universes in long-running media collapse on themselves and constantly seek to spin out new continuities and also voraciously consume those new continuities. There is something cyclical about the way that fictional universes expand and contract, and most notably, of course, accrete continuity and become defined by it. The answer isn't to abstractly delimit continuity, perhaps by introducing a new line of Ultimate comic books, but rather to be in the present of the text, which is hard, because when new comics creators begin working in the field, it's because they want to recreate the comics which meant the most to them when they began reading. So let's take a look at how this second volume of Ultimate Spider-Man expands our sense of Spider-Man's society, his community, both immediate and extended, and how we create some of that friction, some of that narrative conflict in his dual roles contained within that society. Let's take a look here at the cover to Volume 2, Learning Curve. This takes us to issue 8, in which we begin to situate Spider-Man in this wider world. That's really our focus, particularly through the first arc of the second volume here. In this case, we crash into Volume 8, into a robbery being conducted by one of the B-tier Spidey villains, the Shocker, who was created in 1967 in Amazing Spider-Man number 46 by Stan Lee and John Romita Sr. He's typically presented as a low-level criminal and a part of New York's organized crime scene, which makes him a perfect starting point for this arc. He's embedded in the universe. He's a part of this expanded roster of kind of street-level villains who antagonize Spider-Man pretty much consistently, and he's also fairly ridiculous. So it's believable, it's convenient that he can be taken out so quickly here at the beginning of the issue. I have the slide here with the full-page splash. You can see the issue title there, Working Stiff, with Spidey taking out the Shocker on the streets of New York. So Spider-Man, as we meet him in issue 8, is confident and capable, and he is finding his place in the world. But as we see from the reaction of the security guards, he's already not trusted. And this, of course, is an essential part of his characterization. Typically, Spider-Man is beloved of the little guy, the man on the street, the people with whom he has had a personal connection. But the systems, the structures, the society of New York is more skeptical of him, and there's always friction generated between those two different perspectives. If you want to delve into this very specific point more deeply, I cannot recommend enough issue 310 of Peter Parker Spectacular Spider-Man from a couple of years ago. This is an issue written and drawn by the excellent Chip Zdarsky, and it builds out a story from Vox Populi interviews conducted by a documentary filmmaker interested in how the people of New York view Spider-Man. It is touching, it is hilarious, it has a twist that you really should see coming, but I've never talked to anyone who saw it coming the first time reading the book. It's just lovely and really speaks. It's a fond farewell from Zdarsky to Peter Parker, and it works beautifully. I recommend it very highly. So there is here in this interaction between the street-level Spidey and the abstracted, masked, webbed menace that's portrayed by, certain newspapers in the city. There's a tension, a thoughtful, even sophisticated, I think, political understanding at work here. Some heroes work inside the structures of society and some work outside, and we get a lot of stories about people crossing those lines, transforming from one into the other, though we normally wind up reverting to where we belong in the first place. Those heroes which operate outside the bounds of society, like your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, can make individual connections, most of which, because heroes, are going to be positive. But society as a whole has a vested interest in policing those boundaries. Much as we discussed during our unit on Nadia Korafor's Binti trilogy, individual people, therefore, can approve of Spider-Man, or in rare cases, condemn him. But New York City as a functional, self-regulating, self-perpetuating, self-defending society cannot sanction the operation of a vigilante, particularly a masked vigilante. And so Spider-Man is never going to be able to find peace, to find a settled, stable position, a balance between the two. That lack of stability, though, is fully, I think, half of what makes Spider-Man such a compelling and enduring character. Because of who he is, those desires are in constant tension, and the pendulum can only swing back and forth between them. It can never really settle in a happy medium. Peter wants peace. He wants that stable society. He wants to enjoy the fruits of that happy stability. He wants, his life. He wants his family to be happy. He wants to go on dates and have a rewarding job and spend time with Aunt May. But in order to achieve that, and because of his great responsibility, he has to go outside of the bounds to play the vigilante hero and thus be condemned. And in stories where we shift that status quo, most famously perhaps in the original Civil War, when Peter is working for Tony Stark and reveals his identity live on TV, when we shift that status quo, we lose something that's integral to who Spider-Man is, and he becomes less compelling, which means, of course, ultimately that Marvel Editorial hits the reset button and gets him back on the streets, monster or menace. Speaking of which, let's look at the best embodiment of this tension, and perhaps the most important member of Spider-Man's supporting cast, arguably the best member of any superhero supporting cast, one J. Jonah Jameson. Lots of writers have spent time justifying, explaining, exploring why it is that JJJ hates Spider-Man. His wife was murdered by a masked criminal, so he is fearful and suspicious of anyone who chooses to wear a mask. Or his father was abusive and gave him a deep-seated distrust toward people who present themselves as heroic figures, and so on and so on. But those explanations are fundamentally unnecessary, which is why I think even when they are introduced, they are usually discarded, or at least ignored, pretty quickly. Jameson is simply the embodiment of the Daily Bugle, and the Bugle is the embodiment of the Fourth Estate, that body which offers a public civil policing of society's standards. The Fourth Estate here rises from an understanding of, earlier European societies basically being maintained and sustained and elevated by three pillars, the clergy, the nobility, and the common folk. The press here occupying a special role, an interactive role, a role that can both comment upon but also maintain the lines of defense of that shared society. So the Bugle in this role does, I think, provide the function of a moral compass. It can distinguish and it can filter and it can explore. And what we are seeing is the embodiment in J. Jonah Jameson of society's response to Spider-Man, and J. Jonah Jameson being that embodiment, right? Being this pure avatar of the press, cannot sanction Spider-Man. As I say, we provide him with these additional explanations, these additional roles, whether it's around his wife or his father or his son, most commonly. But none of them are really necessary because the Bugle itself must stand opposed to Spider-Man, because that's how we maintain the society that we've established, the society in which we are so invested, the society that even Spider-Man wants to be maintained. The Bugle stands against it, so J. Jonah Jameson stands against it. And when we collapse that, when we fracture that, when we allow there to be a moment of personal connection between the two, again, I'll refer you to Chip Zdarsky's run on Spider-Man from just a couple of years ago. When we collapse that, we are pulling Jameson away from the Bugle. We are rendering him as a human being first, rather than this avatar of the Fourth Estate, the avatar of the press. I'll call attention to, since I've got this slide on the screen here, to just how good Mark Bagley is as an actor. And if Bendis' writing was decompressed in the last volume, it is extremely decompressed in this volume, up to and including the very controversial issue 13, which we'll get to in just a few minutes' time. I know I mentioned it last week, but as we normalize Spider-Man in his society, I think that we're given this opportunity to see Bagley express more subtlety, a wider range of emotions in the cast, right? Spider-Man is moving into, Peter Parker, I should say, is moving into a more normal and grounded world. So there's fewer opportunities to draw a rictus grin on Norman Osborn's face, but instead we get these subtle moments of action and interaction. Obviously, Peter goes and gets his job partly as a photographer with the Bugle, but also, of course, because it's the year 2000, as a young web developer, I guess, if you'll forgive the implicit pun, I suppose. He is maintaining the Daily Bugle's online presence, which is charmingly ramshackle. I really enjoy. I was working for local government around this time, and I'm very familiar with how these large institutions really struggled to pivot to an online presence back in the year 2000. So here we see J. Jonah Jameson, not as a supervillain, as a capable person, a capable editor, as someone with a moral compass, as exploitable as that moral compass can be, right? As skewed by capitalism as that moral compass can be. But in this version in particular, he's less interested in the Bugle's numbers as a raw measure of success, and more as a measure of the moral authority that gives the paper, and by extension gives to him. So he's capable, yes, but he's a small man in a large world, all of which is there on that panel. And since we're talking about Bagley's excellent approach to art, let's skip ahead to the next slide and to Spider-Man's dream, his nightmare of Uncle Ben's death. We get these 2 pages which are just gorgeous. Obviously, this isn't my primary focus. I dropped out of formal art education around the time that we stopped using pencil crayons in class, but I wanted to switch gears to call out just how good this 2-page sequence is. This is still Mark Bagley's art, but here, of course, he's using paint, and it's just luscious. It's just really, really beautiful stuff. Most comics fans, and I'm asking for trouble, I think, to generalize even that much, but here we go. Most comic fans, I would say, prefer Bagley's 90s work on Spider-Man to his work on Ultimate, which I get. As I said last time, Bagley's art isn't my all-time favorite. But in addition to his skill in communicating emotion and my particular love of his sinewy and lithe, short king Spidey, I have to applaud Bagley's commitment to this modern and comprehensive and accessible and, most importantly, perhaps, consistent art style throughout the run of the series. Bagley provides art for the first 111 issues, after which he's replaced by Stuart Immonen, who has a much cartoonier style. Just for contrast here, I'll show you one of Immonen's pages from Ultimate X-Men. This is... not Ultimate. This is from Ultimate Spider-Man 120, which is a crossover with the aforementioned Ultimate X-Men. I was distracted by, the presence of the X-Men. And you can see here, I think, this much cartoonier style, not just in the line work, not just in the detail work, not just in the way that the panels are composed, but in the character designs themselves. Wolverine, in particular, I think, never really looks good in this particular incarnation, though that is a pretty good rendering of Storm, I'll say that much. And I like Immonen just fine, but despite the fact that I am a writer-reader more than I am an artist-reader, I have to force myself, even now when I'm reading comic books, to look at the pictures and not just read the dialogue bubbles, because that's a terrible tendency of mine. I still think that this transition in art is the reason that, in the popular imagination, this run on Ultimate Spider-Man ends at issue 111. I think that Bagley brings a consistency which makes the entire edifice that much more accessible, that much more open to new readers, and really allows Bendis to build his momentum, because there is, I think, a gear shift between different art styles as you move through the run of any long-running comic book. Back to work. Spidey decides, after his dream, to investigate the man who killed Uncle Ben. and finds connections to organized crime in New York City, specifically to Wilson Fisk, the Kingpin. More about the Kingpin in just a moment, but we're going to begin with the first product of Spidey's investigations, the Enforcers. I've got a couple of representative panels here of Montana and Fancy Dan and Ox. The Enforcers, a team of really low-level hoodlums who make their debut in Amazing Spider-Man issue number 10 by Leon Ditko, cover dated March of 1964. This is absolutely representative of the kinds of characters that are being introduced to antagonize Spider-Man directly in those comics. We'll talk a little more about the Rogues Gallery, which is built out by Leon Ditko during those early years. But here we're seeing the ways in which Spider-Man interacts with the criminal underworld of New York City, which, as it's presented in Spider-Man continuity, and by extension in Marvel continuity generally, right? There are lots of street-level heroes in New York City, but Spider-Man has a particular flavor of these kinds of antagonists. He has a particular mode of interaction with these street-level toughs who are generally, engaged in minor robbery, in some smuggling, in some, extortion, in some bribery, the kind of low-level mafioso activity that feels to the reader, at least, authentic to the Manhattan in particular of the 1960s, even if it wasn't really that accurate at the time. We get a glimpse of Peter's high school experience shortly after this, where Spider-Man is being controversially celebrated by Kong, and he agrees to a date with Mary Jane. All he has to do is reschedule that date immediately to Saturday from Friday, because he's planning on going to the party at Fisk Tower. So even here, we're drawing explicit connections. We are drawing threads, webs, if you will, between the two halves of Peter's life. We are never as distinct in our operation as either Peter or as Spider-Man as we are in that original Lee and Ditko run, where, of course, the two halves of Peter's life are providing enormous emotional torque on him and really driving the conflict. That is the conflict engine of the book, is what if one guy had to be two guys who are mutually incompatible? But what we're doing in the Bendis run, what we're doing in Ultimate Spider-Man, is tightly connecting these things and giving all of these various perspectives, all of these various lines of inquiry and lines of analysis on who Spider-Man is, who Spider-Man could be, who Spider-Man is to individual people, and how different people vary in their responses and in their approaches. And I find that fascinating. That's going to continue onward and even accelerate as we move forward. But I do particularly like the new edition of Kong in the high school cast. I love that Kong is such a fan of Spider-Man and is so openly speculating about the details of Spider-Man's life, too. I find that really works. From here, we go to the Fisk Tower. We have our first encounter with the Kingpin. We get our first encounter with Electro, who is also introduced really early in the run. Electro is introduced in Amazing Spider-Man number 9. In fact, as I say, most of Spider-Man's Rogues Gallery are introduced early and really codified by Ditko's amazing art. So the Vulture appears in issue 2 of Amazing Spider-Man. Doc Ock appears in issue 3. The Sandman appears in issue 4. The Lizard appears in issue 6. Mysterio in 13. The Green Goblin, who we saw in last week's reading, of course, is introduced in the original run in issue 14. And Kraven the Hunter is introduced in issue 15. And that's a large part of Spider-Man's Rogues Gallery. That's most, I would say, of his real heavy hitter antagonists. Wilson Fisk, the Kingpin, is introduced in issue 50 in July of 1967, generally as the head of organized crime in New York City. He isn't explicitly superpowered, but what's presented on panel, and certainly what is presented by Spider-Man as a really fatphobic depiction of obesity, is actually muscle, leaving Fisk as one of the few characters who can go toe-to-toe with Spidey in terms of raw physical strength. And boy, we just spent a lot of time leaning on that fatphobic rhetoric throughout the middle arc of this issue in particular. It's kind of tough to read, and a reminder that though the world can seem bleak, though the night can seem dark and full of terrors, we've come a long way since 2001, you guys. We've come a long way. In certain regards, we've come a long way. Here, though, we see one of the most provocative moves that Bendis will make early in the Ultimate Spider-Man run. We see here that having been defeated by Electro, having been held by the Kingpin's minions, Peter is unmasked. And what's more striking here is that the unmasking doesn't matter. It doesn't really change anything. Kingpin, as is demonstrated here, is playing by a different set of rules. He doesn't obey the personal antagonism of the superhero-supervillain dynamic, but he's also immune from the censure and the limitation of society as a whole. He exists outside, and that makes him all the more dangerous. So we're playing with what is expected from the supervillain, and we're playing, too, with the reader's knowledge of the conventions of the genre, which is effective, is powerful. We, the readers, are shocked by this reveal because, well, frankly, we don't expect to see Peter's mask be torn off by a supervillain so early in the run, and we don't expect that to be ultimately meaningless, right? This line that we get from the Kingpin here, toss him out the way he got in. We're just going to throw Peter from the roof of the skyscraper to his death, right? Under any other circumstance, to his death. He is lucky to survive this and survives it in a very injured state. These things are shocking, partly because they are shocking, partly because these are the actions of someone who does not care about consequence, who does not care about moral standards, who does not play by society's rules. So right, within the text, they are shocking. But this is also where our paratext comes in. This is also where we as readers, even if you haven't read the early Spider-Man issues, you have a consciousness not just of Spider-Man, but of how superheroes are supposed to work. And this is not it. You don't unmask your supervillain, your superheroic foe in issue 8 of a brand new run. This is something that's preserved for much more powerful, much more loaded, much more significant, much more roundly numbered issues later down the line. So we're breaking both the internal and the external expectations of what is supposed to happen in a scene like this, and that's part of the problem. Because when we're playing with the reader's expectations of what should happen in a comic book, we are calling to mind those other comic books. We are distinguishing Ultimate Spider-Man not just as a text unto itself, but a text that exists in partial opposition to the pre-existing Spider-Man canon. Part of what makes this so interesting is that this didn't happen before. And when you're drawing that connection, you are drawing a thread between this comic book and every other comic book that you've read, or at least between this incarnation of Peter and every other incarnation of Peter that you've ever read. All the various versions of Peter that have existed, blurred and blended over the history of the 616. And that carries with it a weight. Here we are in issue 8, and we're already accreting that new continuity, yes, but a new continuity that also exists as a paratext with the existing 616 continuity. And if you're reading this now, years after the fact, more than 20 years after the fact, and you're kind of aware of the history of the Ultimate Universe, which you are, dear listener, because I just went over it at the beginning of today's episode, if you're mindful of where the Ultimate Universe goes and what happens with this narrative experiment, this is where you can see the first cracks appear in that firmament, because this is no longer, or at least is not going to be for much longer, a clean entry point. It's not going to be continuity neutral. It's not relying just on the storytelling contained within its own pages. It is becoming interactive, not only with your expectations as a reader, but with the expanded Spider-Man continuity, and in a sense, all of superheroic comics too. It's going to become increasingly bogged down. We'll move forward. We're going to see some more examples of this as we go. In any case, Kingpin is transgressive both within his own medium and without his own medium. Peter is thrown from the building and injured, limps his way home, where he finds, and this is a lovely moment of Bendis storytelling, I think, where he finds a May that has been staying up late, waiting for him. And here it's not that May is critical of Peter for staying out late and wants to know where he's been and all of that kind of stuff, but because of the extra attention and characterization that we gifted Ben Parker in last week's reading, because he is the anchor point of Peter's domestic life. And, he is that anchor point, even in earlier versions of the story, which don't go so far as to explore it and don't let May be a real person. Because in this version, he's rendered more vividly, we get to have this space with May. She is not as close to Peter as she will soon be, as she will ultimately be, because Ben was filling that space. It's created this gulf between them, which is not only a poetic and careful and thoughtful and empathetic way of depicting grief, it is also an opportunity for us to develop this relationship in real time rather than take it as a somewhat informed status quo that's established on page 1 of Amazing Spider-Man, or whatever page of Amazing Spider-Man issue 1 May is introduced, or I guess of Amazing Fantasy 15 May is introduced. That relationship is established there and then remains pretty constant for 1,000 issues of comics. You know, it ebbs and flows, and there are particular storylines that will apply additional tension, additional torque to that relationship. But really, May is just the oldest, most fragile person in the entire universe, and she is only there to be an endangerment for Peter, right? She is a plot point that must be protected by Peter in his Spider-Man guise and in his non-heroic Peter Parker role too. But here, because of the attention that we gave to Ben, because of the investment of our time, our effort, our care, our focus, our attention into that character and his relationship with Peter, the warmth of that relationship, now we get to actually build something with May that isn't just representative, that isn't just archetypal, but is instead specific. And again, Bagley knocking it out of the park as an artist who can communicate very grounded emotions here. I think it's just a really lovely opportunity to delve into the defining relationship of Peter Parker's life and immediately begin to make it something more special, right? To make it more unique, to make it more specific than it has ever really been in the 616 universe. This is something brand new, and it is something brand new which emerges, and I'll use this as a point of contrast against the unmasking that we were just discussing here. This is something brand new that is emerging from this narrative medium itself. It is emerging from the rich soil of Ultimate Spider-Man and the work that we put in, right? We are now reaping the narrative goods that we sowed in the first volume by paying all of that attention to Peter's relationship with Ben and the way that Ben and May interact too. This is not a rejection of 616 May. This is something that wholly exists within the pages of this book, which is just as, if not more, narratively rewarding as the unmasking scene, but doesn't come with those extra bonds of continuity that will slowly begin to weigh us down and to drag down how fresh and accessible this book is. I absolutely love how May is written throughout this volume. And maybe now's as good a time as any to observe that I like Volume 1 just fine. I think Volume 1 is just fine if you're doing a decompressed kind of slow motion rendering of Spider-Man's origin story. If you really want to explore the mechanics, the dynamics of Uncle Ben's death and, you know, this totemic, the burden of with great power comes great responsibility, right? With a great uncle comes great life advice, I guess. But it's really here in Volume 2 that Bendis makes his mark, that he really demonstrates what it is that he is going to do over more than 100 issues of comics. And that's not to say that we're not ever going to be in a, you know, high octane supervillain fight to the death, you know, web slinging between skyscrapers kind of story. We absolutely are going to do all of those things again and again, in fact. But it is going to be grounded in this emotional truth. And I really enjoy that. I really do love the way that Bendis writes this volume, though I do understand too that it is not for everyone. Kingpin, meanwhile, kills Mr. Big. He puts the Spider-Man mask on him and dumps him in the river. A footnote here that Mr. Big is eventually revealed to be Freddy Fosworth, also known previously as Big Man, who was also introduced in Amazing Spider-Man number 10, kind of alongside the Enforcers. Peter makes up with Mary Jane in class when they're supposed to be learning about Nixon, because Bendis is perfectly happy being a little heavy-handed sometimes. And if we're going to be talking about the role of society, if we're going to be talking about what bonds are placed upon us in terms of our behavior, what can be expected and permitted, and what cannot be either expected or permitted, what must be punished, what must be censored by society in order to protect itself, and also, of course, leaning hard into the role of the Fourth Estate, the open, free, truthful press in the preservation of that society. Who else would you talk about than Richard M. Nixon? Well, at least in 2001, who else would you talk about than Nixon? Luckily, here in 2024, we have a few other options, are we so inclined. Peter sends an email using the alias Arthur Simek, who was Artie Simek, I should say, was the Marvel letterer who worked on Amazing Fantasy 15. Just a nice throwback there. When he hears back, we're casually introduced to Patsy Walker, who is a fascinating character because she is one of the very few residents of the Marvel 616 superhero universe, which predates the first issue of Fantastic Four in 1961. Patsy Walker was introduced in the brilliantly titled Miss America magazine in 1944, created by a writer who was really called Stuart Little and an artist called Ruth Atkinson. Patsy here is a teenage girl, and her stories are lighthearted romance comedy comics, kind of Archie-style romance comedy comics. She cameos in Fantastic Four Annual Number 3 in 1965. In 1972, she's reimagined as a superheroic character, and shortly after joining the Avengers in 1975, she adopts the superheroic alias Hellcat. I can here recommend heartily the 2015 series by the excellent Kate Leth, Patsy Walker, aka Hellcat. That book rules. All of this is emblematic of Bendis' desire to pull in these elements of the existing Marvel continuity in new ways, but each one of these bonds carries this weight that introducing a new character wouldn't, or even introducing a new character with a less specific, or introducing an existing character, I should say, with a less specific and established role in the universe would not. That is, Bendis is demanding the intertextual reading, right? He's demanding the positioning of Ultimate as a book tangential to Amazing and Spectacular and all the other Spider-Man titles running in the mainstream Marvel Comics universe, and does not seem to understand that demand, that positioning this book as an intertext and positioning all of these other books alongside Ultimate as intertexts is foiling his very purpose. He is making more difficult his endeavor to create this smooth and contained and internally consistent chronology of Spider-Man's adventures, this continuity that only answers to itself by making these references, whether the reader gets it or not, right? The reader might only get 1 out of every 5, or God knows, 1 out of every 10, 1 out of every 20, but every one that is there is a bond back to the original continuity that is going to tie down this book like Gulliver and Lilliput. We'll close out this week's reading because, look at that, I'm almost out of time. In fact, we'll close out this week's reading and our discussion of Spider-Man for now with issue 13, which, as I mentioned earlier, was extremely controversial. It demonstrates both the excess, I suppose, and the strength of Bendis' style. In the most decompressed comic I have ever read, issue 13 focuses entirely on a single conversation with Mary Jane Watson and a brief follow-up with Aunt May. Besides flashback panels, we never leave Peter's room, and 2 unexpected things happen. First, we get the reveal. I'm presenting a page here of 5 panels in which Peter confesses to a wide-eyed Mary Jane that he is Spider-Man. In 616 continuity, Mary Jane reveals in Amazing Spider-Man 257 that she has known Peter's secret for years, which is an ingenious bit of storytelling that far into the run, but is also clearly incompatible with previous stories in like 20 different ways. The ultimate confession, therefore, is shocking, far more shocking even than Kingpin's desire to unmask Spider-Man, because Kingpin doesn't play by the rules. He doesn't play by the rules of a polite and ordered and civil society, but he also doesn't play by the rules of superheroic books, and Spidey does. Peter does, and here Peter is breaking, God, what is rule number 1 for your costumed, masked vigilantes? You protect your secret identity, and here he shares it immediately with, frankly, someone that he doesn't even know that well, right? His relationship with Mary Jane is not exactly well established at that point, but it speaks to Peter's honesty. It speaks to his desire to be good, his desire to do good, his desire and his belief that he can still be a part of the society that he values, even as he acts outside of its bounds to protect it. This confession erodes the gap, I think, between Peter and Spidey in a really interesting way, and generates additional friction for him, of course, additional romantic friction, and it draws Mary Jane into the world of superheroic adventures, which would not be so effective if not for the second shocking thing that happens in this very dialogue-heavy issue, as we move on here to what might be our final slide, our penultimate slide, in fact, of the evening, the kiss. Obviously, here we see this back and forth, bouncy, as I said last week, David Mamet style, rhetorical, tick-laden dialogue that we get from Bendis. But here, I think it works beautifully. It is intimate, and we are prioritizing Peter's emotional life and the emotional stakes of that life, at least as much as we are prioritizing the much more traditionally heroic and urgent and dangerous stakes of his superheroic life. Usually, danger comes from without and suffering comes from within, particularly if you are Peter Parker, right? You have to go and fight the Shocker and the Rhino and the Scorpion. Thus, you have to miss your date with MJ, and you're going to feel bad about it, and she is going to feel bad about it, and that suffering is going to be enkindled by the superheroic persona that you also occupy. Here, we're seeing a much more gentle take on the division between the two halves. Bendis here, I think, is actually deliberately striving to unite those two separate things. He seems to me to be fundamentally less interested in a Peter Parker who is distinctly Spider-Man, separately Spider-Man, and is more interested in exploring the emotional entanglements, the complex psychological reality of being a teenager who is also simultaneously a superhero. And that's smart. I think that's wise. I think it's not something that you can do in 1962 when your longest stories can run for a single issue. You know, I think that it's not until the mid-30s, I think, of Amazing Spider-Man that we even get a multi-part story that spans more than one issue at a time. Those stories have to be self-contained, which means that there has to be something of a status quo to which we can reset at the end of every issue, and you just don't have the space to explore the ways in which Peter and Spidey coexist and fail to functionally, peacefully coexist too. The kiss here is very good. Of course, I find this very sweet. These two little idiots making this choice and kind of exploring this life together. Mary Jane's line here about hitting the jackpot, "Face it, Tiger, you just hit the jackpot," is of course a direct echo of Mary Jane's first on-panel appearance all the way back in Amazing Spider-Man 42, written by Stan Lee and drawn by John Romita Sr. I'm putting that slide up here. This very famous 2 panels here, right at the end of the issue, where after ducking Mary Jane for issue after issue, I think, God, maybe something like 15 issues at this point, Peter has been on and off again, ducking this arranged date with the young Miss Watson here. And then she shows up and she is stunning. And even by the standards of, art from the early 1960s here, she just looks very modern. She looks very cool and presents him with this line, "Face it, Tiger, you just hit the jackpot," which is kind of why Mary Jane Watson is the best, because you would not know this necessarily from various cinematic versions of Mary Jane, but in the comics, at least, she is presented as someone with a great deal of joie de vivre. She is passionate and spontaneous and happy and excited. Bendis here delivers a really great take on Mary Jane and the level of excitement that she feels discovering that her boyfriend, her almost boyfriend, Peter, is really this costumed superhero. She's thrilled by it. She is fiery, right? As fiery as her red hair would suggest. And that makes her a fantastic counterpoint to Pete, who is so burdened with responsibility and who has such real responsibilities, not just of the superheroic variety, but also of the domestic variety. He has to earn enough money to keep Aunt May safe. He has to care for Aunt May, particularly in those early books when she is, as I previously said, the most elderly and decrepit person who has ever lived. There is a chance on any given day that a stiff breeze could just end May Parker's life. And Peter has to be conscious of that. He has to be mindful, and he has to tend to that. So Mary Jane being this active counterpoint is just another source of this fantastic generative friction and conflict that drives these stories. Peter has to be responsible in 2 or 3 different ways, right? As a good student, as a good nephew, as a good superhero, he has to be responsible, but he also wants to be Mary Jane's boyfriend. He also wants to be caught up in the romance and the excitement and the spontaneity of that world. It's one of the reasons I think that Mary Jane is the girl, right? She is Peter Parker's partner basically forever. I mean, obviously there's Gwen Stacy. Obviously there are other characters. There are other romantic entanglements that Peter finds himself in throughout the long, long course of his fictional life. But it's always Mary Jane. And I think that that's just a really fascinating and a fascinating and generative combination of characters. And interestingly, it's a fascinating and generative combination of characters that we see very much, I think, inverted in the MCU, where, Zendaya is playing Michelle Jones. She's playing the MJ surrogate character there and is kind of dour and kind of taciturn and kind of, sarcastic and kind of above it all, and is still providing that contrast to Tom Holland's very fresh-faced, energetic, ebullient, optimistic Peter Parker, right? The Peter Parker that we get in the comics is not very much like the Peter Parker that we have seen in, I said the MCU, I think, but what I mean is, of course, the Sony spin-off of the MCU. So I find that combination to be so strong. And here, of course, we're also playing in the playground of the early 21st century, and we're playing in the playground of new sexual dynamics and sexual mores between teenagers here. The ongoing recurring beat through all of this that Aunt May suspects that they are at the very least making out. And then when Mary Jane is so excited that she begins leaping on Peter's bed and we get those terrifyingly ominous squeak, squeak, squeak sound marks on the page. And of course, May jumps to entirely the wrong conclusion. That isn't entirely the wrong conclusion because the world is dangerous. And we're talking about the role of society and the role of culture and where we draw the lines. And we are anchoring Peter in a very specific, I think, immediately post-millennial contemporary sexual culture, right? This is the shadow of the AIDS panic of the 80s moving into the internalized modern adolescent sexual culture of the early 2000s. And when I say modern there, of course, I do not mean by the standards of 2024. I mean by the standards of 2002. It's really lovely. It's a very powerful sequence, and the scene that he gets, the heartfelt scene, the moment of connection that we get with May at the end of the issue, I think works beautifully as they both confess that they like Mary Jane a lot. And I think that finishing this second volume, we're in a really strong place to move forward. Though we are not going to move forward. That is it for our discussion of Ultimate Spider-Man and our discussion of metatext in comics in general, at least for now. Before we wrap it up, though, we do have some business to take care of for our next unit. A little while ago, you guys voted to cover Professor Tolkien's elven mythology, his history of Arda, the Silmarillion, and I'm excited, I'm thrilled, I cannot wait to get into it, but I am making the difficult decision to forestall that series for just a little while so that I can make some space in my schedule to finally go back and finish my Tolkien series there and back again, because I left our intrepid heroes poised on the brink of returning to the Shire at the end of The Return of the King, and it has been too long. They have been waiting there too long, and strangely, or perhaps not strangely, it doesn't feel right getting into the Silmarillion with that project left unfinished. So, now that I've reached the end of my other podcast project, The Last Star in Hollywood, available at laststarpod.com, I have the time to go back to finish There and Back Again, and then to continue onward with Tolkien, which creates an interesting gap in the schedule here on Stars and Swords. And since it's almost spooky season, I thought it would be fun to cover some classic horror. So by the time you hear this, there will be a poll available over on the Patreon page. That's patreon.com/nextword. And if you help support the podcast, you'll be able to cast your vote and choose between 4 texts, which are maybe predictable, but predictable for a reason. Our next unit will be one of these stories. Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus by Mary Shelley, published in 1818, an anguished, haunting fusion of the Gothic and the Romantic, an unusually prescient book. We might consider Dracula by Bram Stoker, published in 1897, an absolute classic, a much more complex and challenging and rudely modern text than you might expect. If you are kind of tired of vampire stories, and I am sometimes known as someone who is kind of tired of vampire stories, I urge you to consider Dracula, because it is like no other vampire story that you've ever read, which might seem wild if you've never read it, but it is an extraordinary piece of work that has a great deal to say about our modern world. We might consider The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, published in 1959, like an absolutely foundational text of modern horror, perhaps the definitive haunted house story. I think that it stands completely apart. Also, some of the most brilliant and luminous prose that you will ever read in your lives. Or we might consider the modern horror text, perhaps The Shining by Stephen King, published in 1977. Not my favorite King book, I will say, but probably the most influential of all of his many, many novels. It's a really wonderful and rich text that we can absolutely spend the month of October diving through. Now, obviously, some of those texts are longer than the others. Frankenstein and Hill House are pretty short. Dracula and The Shining are not so much, so the schedule will be a little flexible until the votes are in. But stay tuned to starsandSwords.com for further updates. And I'm not above the idea of padding out the end of October with an extra spooky bonus if we do pick Frankenstein or Hill House. I've just been rereading my Lovecraft and I have some thoughts on those stories, so there may be a little one-shot on Call of Cthulhu or something like that right at the end of the month if we need it to fill our schedule out. And then the Silmarillion. That's going to do it for this episode of Stars and Swords. Before I go, though, my sincere thanks for this opportunity to talk about The Spidered Man and about a run of comics which I still think is just one of the most significant and influential ever. I think that you can put this Bendis Bagley run on any list of the greatest and most influential and most complete and comprehensive comic runs of all time. I had been kicking around an idea for the last couple of years of reading and reviewing every single issue of Amazing Spider-Man, starting from the Lee Ditko era on to the modern day, but this has only honestly tempted me to undertake that very ambitious project all the more. So thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for listening. I will be back next week on YouTube, no less. So if you'd like to join me live for whatever our spooky text will be, then head on over to the Patreon page and pledge your support. In exchange, and in addition to the bushel of bonus episodes for this podcast and for others, you will get the link to the live session next Monday night. Also, stay tuned to starsandSwords.com for the announcement of that forthcoming haunted text as soon as the poll results are in. That's going to do it for this week. As always, face it, Tiger, you just hit the jackpot. Thanks for listening.